I think my colleague from Burundi was talking to me, and he was saying, well, he wants to take this back and discuss with people in Burundi. And what happens if you're using this in a conflict setting? How do these relationships change? It becomes more complicated. But one thing you can do is to take something like this and simplify it and discuss with people what strategies are you taking in each area. How are they linking up? I think the point that was made back here about nobody can do this all. How do you build alliances? Is very, very important across each of these. Many of us focus on one of these strategies, but what brings them together? But we're going to deepen. Already this is a big enough challenge. In the next few minutes, we're going to deepen it by focusing on what's in the middle. Power and politics. None of these things happen, as you know, without some contention, some conflict. In each step, some people have more power than others. Our friends from Latin America reminded us that when you're talking about DRR, you're oftentimes talking about big questions of land and rights and really getting into fundamental questions of vested interest in a particular community. So we've been developing at our institute another tool, another approach for how do we understand power. We're talking about empowered participation. What do we mean by that? Where does it happen? So this next few minutes we're going to ask you this question. How do you understand power in order to bring about change? And given that, where are the entry points for effective action? And we're going to talk about what are the forms of power, what are the levels of power, what are the spaces. And already this has come up a little bit. You've been talking, for instance, a lot about the link between the local and global. You've been talking a lot about the differing forms that power plays. And also, where do we enter? Do we enter the traditional authority? Is that the space, or do we go to the national space? Which spaces do we enter? If you put all those together, we have been playing with this tool. It looks a bit like this in the end. You know the Rubik's Cube. Some of you may know it's this game that you play. And so this is the Rubik's Cube of power. And we've actually found a number of NGOs I'm sharing this with you because Marcus's request, because a number of NGOs are finding this tool useful in doing analysis in their own setting. So as I go through, think about, Ken, is something you might want to use to analyze what kind of power relations you're trying to change in your own setting or in your own strategy. Next month we'll be launching on an online web resource on how to do power analysis called powercube.net. And the address is on here at the end. I'll leave it for you. But so if you don't get it all here, there's many applications, hundreds of applications of this that are being used by groups, and we're putting them all online so that other people can take it and experiment with it. So that might deal with the frustration of time here. You don't have to get all of this time. I'll expose you a little bit to our way of thinking, and then you can take it and try it in your own settings, and you'll take it much further than we. I'd be happy to hear. So let's think about what do we mean by power. Now, I'm not going to go into the theory, but usually when we think about power, we think about power over. Somebody has power over somebody else. And that's the way we've been thinking about it here. It's people who are vulnerable to other people's power. And that might be sort of the negative way of thinking about power. And if we think about that, then how do we bring about change? Well, you bring about change by empowering the powerless to take more power from the powerful. It involves conflict. So that's one way. But there's other forms of power I just want you to keep in mind which are more positive. One is about the power to. Empowerment is about the empowerment to act. It's about realizing your own ability as citizens. And you've been talking a lot of that here. How do people act for themselves? Another is the power with. That is the power of building associations and networks and alliances. And that's what GDR is all about, as I understand it. You're trying to figure out how you can have power with others to enable the power of people to act. And we've discussed about that. And thirdly is this notion of the power within. That is power that people feel within themselves to speak for themselves with dignity. So when I say power, don't just think about the negative form, think about the positive forms. And maybe this afternoon when you're talking about your networks, you can think about a bit more. How does your network help you to have the power to strengthen others with each other in order to change the power over that certain institutions have in our lives? Okay? But what do we mean? I'm going to talk you through things. I'm going to ask you to give me some examples from your own experience. Now, lots of times, there's three different dimensions of power. The first one here, let's talk about visible power. Whoops. Sorry, that'll come up in a minute. Visible power. Some people say you can tell who has power by looking at who's participating in a decision-making arena, a forum, a consultation, and you see whose voices prevail and whose voices are ignored. And based on that, you say, oh, in this community or in this country, those people seem to have a lot of power because their voices are heard more. Okay? Can you give me an example of a visible space of power in your work? Anybody? I heard it come up earlier. You said, oh, well, these people always speak in the meeting. They predominate at the local level. Yeah? Or the national level, or the officials always speak. So if we're trying to change power, one thing we can try to do is change who speaks and who participates in that open, visible space, which is usually the constitutional forum or the consultative forum or whatever. Okay? But those people who've studied power have said, no, that's not the only way power works. There's a second kind of power, which is called hidden power. And hidden power is the ability to keep certain people or certain issues from getting into that visible space in the first place. Okay, so think about an example. You may have a meeting, and one dimension of power is who's speaking in that meeting and who's prevailing and who's deciding. But another dimension is asking who's not even at this meeting. What are the barriers that are keeping those voices and their knowledge and their issues out of this room, off the table altogether? Can you give an example? The form of power that keeps voices off the table altogether, or people off the table.
Women and gender.
Gender relations, customs about who's allowed to speak in public places, right? Another one.
Marginalized.
People are marginalized. How are they marginalized? What marginalizes them?
I'm looking at people are deformed or some form of physical challenge. People with incapacitation.
That's right.
Yeah.
They don't feel capability to speak in that setting.
Seniority and age prevents the youth from participating.
Thank you, sir. Exactly. Seniority and age, so the youth aren't allowed to speak in that space. Okay? So there's many, and you mentioned another one, very important one before the session, which was knowledge on DIR. It's technical. And so if you don't talk the talk of this issue, then maybe your voice isn't so legitimate.